Hi, and welcome to Kent County Closeup. I'm Deb Havens. Have you heard the story about the wealthy man who owned a land, a factory, and a beautiful mansion? He fell in love with a young working girl only to be driven from his home and have it burned to the ground. And it's not the tale of Jane Eyre. This is the story of Horace Childs and Childsdale, a lost village from a lost time, one of the few such early towns in Plainfield Township. But what difference does it make if we know or don't know about these tales? Today we'll find out with my guest, Norm VanSoest, a historian of the disappearing history in Plainfield Township. So, Norm, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, my pleasure. You've collected some fascinating stories about the past in Plainfield Township and Kent County as well, and I mentioned the lost village of Childsdale, but there are many more tales, including one of my favorites, which is the legend of Chief Wabasis and the missing treasure trove of gold that's supposedly buried someplace in Plainfield Township, and we'll get into that. But first, I'd really like to know why you are interested in history. I mean, in school, it's typically the subject that most people hate the most. So what is it that's so important about history that's fascinated you?
Well, I believe strongly that if you don't understand and know the history, you have a more difficult time in planning the future and not repeat many of the same mistakes that make time after time. And your comment about history being taught in the schools is a somewhat dry course, and I'm probably as guilty a student as anyone during that period of time, because I think they dwelled too much on dates when Thomas Jefferson did so and so, and rather than the concept behind of what he accomplished or any of the founding fathers accomplished. And I think that's true all the way through our history. And then I also, as I've gotten older, and my mother lived to be 96, and I oftentimes would, when I was living out of state, would come in and visit with her, and we'd drive through the countryside. And I kick myself now I didn't record all the things that she told me, because they are going to be lost. Her generation is all gone, and many of them, my generation is gone. And so much of this history, both family and the community, is going to be gone forever. And once it's gone, it's no way of recouping it.
Yeah, and that's very sad, considering the richness of some of the history that I've learned from you just in previous conversations. But let's explore that a little bit. This whole idea of a lost village inside of Plainfield Township. Let's start again with Childsdale. I mentioned that it was one of the towns that grew up along the Grand and the Rogue Rivers, and now it's only a name on a street sign, basically, but it was quite a bustling community. Is that right?
That's correct. Actually, Childsdale started out as a lumber sawmill, and that was abandoned. And then Mr. Childs, shortly after the Civil War, purchased what was left of the sawmill and about a couple hundred acres, and did a very successful business. But he was producing paper, mostly butcher paper, for the Chicago market, and he was doing very well. And then his son took over in the late 1880s, and he was very well liked by his employees. He basically owned all of the buildings in town, and he paid his people in scrip, but they were very sensitive to their employees. And many stories about how one family needed shoes for the kids, so his wife would take them into Grand Rapids and buy clothes for them, and shoes and what they needed. And it was interesting because it was a very successful business until he stepped out of line, so to speak.
And then I understand that his wife threw him out of the house, and he lost everything.
Yeah, he took up with a postmistress, very, very young gal, and of course his wife was very young too. But anyway, he built her a big 24-room mansion there in Childsdale when he married her, because she was just out of high school. But when this happened with his little playing with the postmistress, she kicked him out, and she moved into Grand Rapids. But she said that if he ever took her in that house, she would burn it down. But it was sat vacant for several years and mysteriously burned down. We have no idea.
Well, now what's interesting is that business was focused on lumber, and Michigan, of course, was a huge supplier for lumber at that particular time in the late 1800s, probably even before then. So what happened to that kind of industry?
Well, when Mr. Childs bought the old lumber mill, and he converted into making paper. So basically, the lumbering industry is pretty much on the downslide at that point. And so he was making that butcher paper, plus he also converted to what they call straw paper, some kind of a process they used. And I think, it's hard to say what happened because it was in operation into the 20th century. But they had their somewhat of their ups and downs with recessions and so forth. But Horace expanded the business, and he actually ended up with about 750 acres. He had quite an operation there. And yet you can second guess and say, well, if he hadn't done what he had done and stuck with business, it may have survived. But it was eventually sold and then just died out. And it was had different, even in the 1920s and 30s, and 40s, there were different people bought it out, tried to make a go of it, but it never happened.
Yeah, and then an entire community ends up moving away, basically. I mean, the business died, and so there was nothing there to hold folk.
Yeah, well, a big difference too when the railroads came through in 1867. It made a difference for all of the communities, as a matter of fact, Plainfield Village and Belmont, because the transportation was totally different. Where before, in the case of Plainfield Village, it was dependent on the river trade, steamboats on Grand River, and where they were located is at the highest point of the Grand River in the state. And it was a crossroads, Indian crossroads, and it was also a crossroads for the stagecoach early on. And
well, let me stop you right there, because the whole notion that there was once, first of all, steamboats going up and down the Grand River is kind of hard to imagine in this day and age. And then the thought that there was a train that came into Plainfield Township. Well, it wasn't a township then. We had all these little villages. And that, as I understand it, used to stop in Belmont, which was called Belmont Station, correct?
Well, first it was called Whitney, and then it was called Belmont Station, and then Belmont. And I think the Belmont Station came when the railroad came through. Belmont is a little unusual compared to the other ones, because I still have tried to figure out why it was even settled, because there was, the hotel was built after the railroad came through. But the only industry that was taking place was a gravel pit, and then they had the ice harvesting operation that harvest ice in the winter off the ponds. And it's interesting enough, in a research that was done on another project, is that the owners of the gravel company had the same name as the president of the Grand Rapids, Indiana Railroad. And he had an extra siding there in Grand Rapids where he parked his own private car. Oh. So I suspect that's probably why he had a lot of influence. And so the railroad made a stop there, and that changed the complexion of that too, because eventually the mail was delivered to Belmont as opposed to Plainfield Village.
Oh, because of the train.
Because of the railroads, yeah.
Okay, so the train goes and brings the mail, and then we get a post office.
And right,
and then we get a little community, which is pretty much the way it is now.
You're exactly right. And probably when I was growing up there, and because I was born in Belmont, and born and raised there, and probably in the 1940s, it was probably no different than it was in 1919. Really? So it really hadn't changed much. It was basically a farm community, and really no industry or anything else. So there was the difference now. Of course, the ballroom where the hotel is taken off and it is removed, and it's a private residence. And
so there was a ballroom above.
Oh yeah, the ballroom was a building on the side, and it had the second floor. Because I remember when I was a teenager, on Saturday night they would have what they called a box social, and the women would come in with the dinner for two, all in the box, and they'd no name or anything on them. They would auction them off. So the men would, bid on a box, and that was his dinner date for the evening. And
I love that idea. I think we should do that again.
then they had a group that played in. In fact, one of the fellows that I had talked to not too long ago was in his 90s, played the guitar for the group that they played of that evening, and people danced and so forth. And they allowed the teenagers to come in after the dinner was over with, though, so they can dance. So.
Well, so did you have to be single to, first of all, supply a box lunch or to order one?
No, the women would put together a dinner, like a chicken dinner, and in a container and bring it in.
So it wasn't really like a date matchup, more. It
Oh
was,
no! It was just a fun time. The
okay.
guys would bid on the prettiest box, for example, and that was who he had dinner with that night.
But I still think it's kind of tricky if you're married to somebody who's having dinner with somebody else.
Yeah, you can't take that in the wrong way there. But it was. But that whole part of the building has been torn down. In fact, in the 40s, a group got together, and my family was part of it, forming a co-op association, and bought the building. And Jake Hardick had a feed mill in at that time, and bought the building. And that, as the community changed and the farming went away, that ended that whole era.
Mm-hmm.
But interesting. But
Well, let's go a little further north up the river, because there was also another town called Jericho,
Right.
which is kind of an interesting name. I mean, Childsdale was connected to the owner, Mr. Childs,
Right.
of that factory. But where does Jericho come? It sounds biblical.
well, there's really not too much information I could find on it. It had been referred to in some of the articles and stories as just a hamlet, and it was a sawmill, and then it just closed up, and the only remains that you can identify is the name of the road that goes down to it, so Jericho.
Again, just a street sign.
But I found very little information on it.
But again, a time of lumbering before probably the end of the 1800s, and then it just folded up when the lumbering business folded.
The heyday of the lumber was in the 70s and 80s, I believe, and this is that had an effect on Plainfield Village too, because not only the railroad caused it to die, but it was referred to as a shingle capital of the world at one point.
The shingle capital.
Shingles, roofing shingles.
And they were making that out of wood?
Well, they would harvest those and then stack them up until in the warehouse there, until the ice cleared, so the steamboats would come up. Then they would take them, haul them off and haul mostly the Chicago market. And so when the railroads came through, of course, they replaced the steamboats, and so that and the demise of the lumber industry pretty much sealed Plainfield Village. Now the buildings were standing until the early 1920s. In fact, there was still a restaurant in operation in 1920 called Macaulay's restaurant there, which was in the old hotel in Plainfield Village.
In Plainfield Village.
Yeah, and that was a well-known restaurant. There's photos of people coming from Grand Rapids in the carriages or coming up with a steamboat, and there was some pictures there of some cars, probably a vintage about 1900 or so.
So this was a tourist destination to go to.
It was for that restaurant.
In Plainfield
Yeah.
Village. Well, let's talk about the village for a minute, because now that was located, as I understand it, on the north side of the bridge that's at Northland and West River Drive.
Yeah, north of the river, correct.
Right, and on the banks of the Grand River. So again, oriented toward a steamboat traffic. And then I understand that there was an Indian village that was actually on a bluff above.
Yes, right.
What? Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, how was that there? Obviously, before Plainfield Village was constructed.
Oh yeah, that village was there. It was a pretty good sized village, from what I understand. There was a smaller one across the river, but that was the main one. And the first squatters came in, I think, in 1834, before it became even federal property. And Livingston's came in, George Miller came in 1836. In fact, his house was just not too long ago was torn down. It was on near the Rogue River Road and the river.
And this is before Michigan even became a state.
Yeah, Michigan became a state in 1837.
Right.
And Plainfield Township was formed in 1836.
Oh my goodness.
Which is also misleading because it covered a much greater area than what we call Plainfield Township now.
Oh really?
Yeah, and I've got another little project I worked on called evolution of the Plainfield Township, because it encompassed what is now Algoma, Oakfield, Cortland, and Cannon.
Oh wow.
At one time, yeah, when it originally was settled.
Well, I want to go back to the Indian Village in just a moment, but
yeah.
I wanted to ask you too, and it kind of fits into this notion of having such a huge territory originally where Plainfield Village was located, but it actually began to compete with Grand Rapids at some point. That's over the issue of where the courthouse would be established.
Yeah, Plainfield was then running for the location of the county courthouse, and they lost out because Grand Rapids chartered, and so they were way ahead of. That's another thing. Growing up, I heard oftentimes that Plainfield was older than Grand Rapids, and also Plainfield Village was at one time larger, and neither one was true. I think about the largest Plainfield, got the best estimates I can find, was about 800 people. Oh. But it was not a defined boundary, and you have to say, okay, I'm counting people from Rogue River over, so far. And where Grand Rapids was chartered, and they knew what the population was, so.
Do you know when it was chartered?
I'm sorry?
When Grand Rapids was chartered?
What year?
Yeah.
Offhand, I don't
but
remember.
obviously before Plainfield.
Many of my piles of notes, I'd have that, but I don't.
No, don't take anything out of your pockets.
I can only remember so much. So.
Okay, well, let's go to the village concept then, or not the concept, but just the legends, perhaps, behind the Indian village that was on the bluff above Plainfield Village, which is where Chief Wabasist was supposed to have been known to wander.
Well, there's a lot of stories that he actually was leaving Plainfield Village, or his village there near Plainfield Village, on his way home. His home was in Wabasist Lake, in the bluffs above Wabasist Lake in Oakfield Township. And he was on his way home, but all of that can't be true, because number one, the village was gone by that time. The Treaty of 1836 is when the federal government took over the property from Indians. And I think in 1850 they decreed that all Indians had to leave the area unless they owned property, unless they actually filed and bought property. And there were stories about them going down on canoes and rafts to Grand Haven, where they loaded aboard a steamer taken up to Oceana County, where they had a reservation.
And what tribe was this?
I'm sorry?
Which tribe?
This was primarily the Ottawa and Chippewa. Chippewa and Ottawa Indians were related. They spoke basically the same language, and so the Treaty of Chicago was with the Potawatomi, and that was more south of the river. And anyway, so basically, at the time he was murdered, there really was no longer any village up there. That had pretty much gone. The Indians had moved out. So
Chief Wabasist, I didn't realize that places like Lake Wabasist and so on were named for him, but apparently he was a very influential person at the time he lived.
Well, he was good friends of the the House family. Andrew House was one of the first settlers in the area, and the family were friends with him. The Smith family, which I have contact with the descendants and got a lot of information from them to verify some other, some of the other myths and dismiss some of the myths. But he was well liked. Now, where it changed, and you'll find some of the histories in like history of Kent County, and I think it was 1870. They really there was a lot of anti-Indian sentiment at that time too, like there was out west. And so some of the articles were written about him, which were not very valid. And Homer Birch, who is a good source of information, because he's a well-respected historian of the Grand River Valley, and he did a lot of study and did a lot of In fact, he got the grandson of Dr. Chief Wabbas's grandson, and because the family moved out of the area because of these bad reputations
really?
that he was a drunkard and so forth. And that's, I just miss those because you have a hard time convincing me that people like the Smith family and the Andrew House family, all these people would have been friends with a drunkard,
Okay, so if I understand, what you're saying is that Chief Wabasis, as portrayed in news coverage of that era, was tainted with some of the prejudices about Native
Yes.
Americans, and so he's got this reputation of being a drunk and disorderly character. And you're saying, but he would likely have not been friends with some of the most important white settlers at that time if he
Right.
had been that kind of character.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, moving on from there, so there's this tale of him being murdered for an enormous amount of gold that he was carrying around, and that gold then disappeared, and the rumor is that it might still be buried here in Plainfield Township somewhere. So how do we start unpacking that?
Yes, the rumors were just unbelievable. In fact, you still see articles being written which were based on previous articles about the wealth. But one important thing to remember is that at the time of the treaty, the Indians were no longer paid by village, where they would normally give the money to the chief, and he would disperse with his own village.
Okay, now this was because the treaty with the federal government gave some sort of compensation to
Yes,
the Indian chiefs,
yes.
and then they were supposed to
Yeah,
distribute it. Okay.
I've read the Treaty of Washington several times, and what it does, it basically gives the Indians in the whole area, and it's a defined area, X number of millions of dollars plus, agree to put schoolhouses up and put in breakfast shops and so forth. And so I could never get a handle on how much money each Indian had, and no one can because Indians were mobile. Mm-hmm. And you could never get a count to find out exactly how many are eligible to draw money. But the law was changed, the federal government changed the law so that each individual had to draw their own money. The chief no longer took it. So the stories about he stole the money from the rest of the Indians in the village is not true because he was not given their money to start with. Okay, that's
So
part
one
of
of
it.
these tales then starts with the attributing a theft to him from the money that he was supposedly gathered
Right.
from the federal government, and that couldn't have been because the government simply wasn't
Right.
distributing dollars at that time. Okay, so what's another myth about him?
Well, that the reason he was murdered was because he signed the treaty, and that's not true because I read the treaty and his signature is not on there.
So this was a treaty between the
Treaty between
Indian
the federal
nation.
government, Treaty of Washington in 1836. And so he never signed that, although from some of the articles I read that he was in favor of it being purchased, but he had nothing to do with it. But Homer Birch has written some great articles about that. And I concur with him when he says that basically what Chief Wabasis had was his own money, because he liked to carry it around and jingle the coins in his bag that he carried it in. And so, yeah, there is money buried.
You're sure of that?
I am positive of it because, fortunately, I have information that Homer Birch didn't have because I've had contact with the Smith family. And through their family history, I've gotten other information. So I was able to put more credible evidence that he was coming from Grand Rapids. And Mr. Smith's home and farm was on West River Road in Section 20, which is just like north of Comstock Park. And so it's a stopping place because the legend is that he was warned at the Festival of the Green Corn, which takes place in the late summer and early fall. And he came to Grand Rapids because there was a group in N Street where they celebrated that. And he was warned that he was going to be robbed. So that's when he stopped at Mr. Smith's house, borrowed the kettle, disappeared, came back to the family. He was invited to stay for dinner, but he refused and continued on home. And he was murdered then at Rum Creek. And if you look at the map and look at the locations, it makes sense, more sense than him coming from the
Grand
village
Rapids.
that no longer existed.
So you think that he buried his gold somewhere between leaving the Smith house?
Most of the search for the gold was in the Wabasas Lake area. There was the road has been relocated. When they relocated the road, they filled in a cave. And if you go to Wabasas Lake now, if you take where they go down to the boat launch, that's part of the old road, and the rest of it, you can see where it was. It's a 2-track that they've got cabled off. But they filled in that cave, but that's where most everybody looked for it. There are stories they took it out in the middle of Wabasas Lake and buried it, which I don't think is true. He would not have, because he got murdered before he got home, so that didn't make sense either. So basically, I contend that that gold is buried in Section 20 someplace. And it could be anywhere from the Grand River to wherever, because it's a big area, some big bluffs there too. And the Smith family are aware of that. The descendants are. They've talked about it. And in fact, one of them has visited the Smith gravesite in West River Road here, I think in the 70s, article in the Grand Rapids Press about that. And she, at that time, that lady, that descendant, said that the family dismissed it, so they never looked for the gold. It was just a comment in the history of Kent County, basically. So,
well, I think it's a great comment.
But it is a great story, and the fun part of researching that was trying to chase down all these myths and see how many are actually true, and most of them are not. So,
well, Norm, you are a member of the Plainfield Township Historical Advisory Committee, and I think you should suggest that we have a big gold hunt picnic or something. That sounds like, except we'd probably be digging far too many holes in the township. I doubt they'd approve it, but it sounds like fun, don't you think?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe. Okay, well, one of the things I really want to underscore is how much fun it is to hear these stories and know something about our history. It's interesting too, because when we think about the impact of paper mills and that sort of thing, and now we hear it in the context of the pollutants and all of the groundwater damage that was done by these factories, and so in a way it helps us have a context of how the progress that we made as a state, as a nation, as a community, it also has a price to be paid, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to be knowledgeable of what impact these forces have had so that we can be aware of it today. So I'm very glad to have you here to share some of this. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, we have made a lot of advances in cleaning the area up, but we've also made a lot of advances of polluting. And I go back again when I was a teenager, and one of my being a farm boy in a lot of area, I had a big playground to play in, and there was a swimming hole we had in Rogue River Road, right near Rogue River Road. In fact, about where the bridge is now, it's been relocated, and it was condemned because the chemicals had just completely coated the bottom of the river, and it was smelly, and it came from 2 sources, basically. And I was delighted here just a few years ago, because I lived out of the state for a number of years, to go back to that area and look at how clean it was. Fly fishing is open now north of Rockford and some of the areas, and trout are back. That's progress. That is real progress. Unfortunately, we're running into what you read in the paper almost daily about what's happening in that Belmont area and up near Rockford, those chemicals that were used 50 years ago. And obviously not much attention was paid to if there was any future damage, and I think that's one of the problems we have.
And that is one of the big lessons of our history, to stay on top of these
And it
kinds
is,
of
because
things.
going back to what I said earlier, if we don't really know what happened back there, we just make the same mistakes over and over again.
Very
Part of it,
powerful.
so.
Very powerful. Well, Norm, thank you so much for being here and sharing the history that not only is fun and inspiring, but is important for us to know, just for our health and safety as we move through the future. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Good. And the history of our nation's birth is basically a story we tell about ourselves, our ideals, and our goal to create a more perfect union. Every one of us and every community past, present, or future is part of the story. And that's it for Kent County Closeup. Thanks for joining us with the production team here at GRTV in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Well, good.
Yeah, you had some fun?